The following program is a production of Pioneer Public Television.
Hello and welcome to Compass. This week, a look at the help that is available to navigate the legal system. We have in our Granite Falls studio two individuals who can help us explain what is available through legal aid. Ann Hefkin is the Executive Director for Legal Services of Northwestern Minnesota, and she's based in Moorhead. Deb Economou is on the board of that same organization. She's a retired attorney and assistant professor at the University of Minnesota Morris with specialization in the areas of business law and employment law. And she also serves on the Pioneer Public Television Board of Directors. So, Ann, Deb, thanks for joining us on Compass.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Huge topic here on legal aid, so I'd like to start by narrowing it a little bit because so many people talk about civil law and criminal law, and when we talk about legal aid here, we're really talking about civil law, correct? So, Ann, tell us then, based on that, what your group does.
Sure. So I work for Legal Services in Northwest Minnesota. We are a nonprofit organization that helps low-income individuals dealing with non-criminal issues. So if someone is charged with a crime and they can't afford an attorney, they are entitled to a public defender, and that's constitutionally mandated. There was a very famous case called Gideon that requires that. But on the civil side, which is everything else where courts might be involved, there is no such legal right to counsel. So we try and fill that gap for low-income families and individuals when really critical basic needs have a legal solution. So we can talk more about what those things are going forward, but it's, again, we're on the civil side where we give free legal help for low-income families and individuals.
Sure. And I know, Deb, this has been a particular interest of yours because you're on the board.
Yes.
So.
Yes, it's important to serve people who are in need. And just like we help people in the medical aspect of things with things like Medicare or Medicaid, Judicare is something that I think fewer people know about, but it's the government, private, nonprofit way of helping people who have really basic needs. I mean, we're helping families and people who need help in housing or income maintenance or especially during the trauma of divorce and child custody issues. These are really critical, really basic needs that need to be met.
And yet, I suppose there are a great many people who may not even be aware that these services are available unless they have been in a situation where they needed them. Do you find that?
Exactly.
Yeah, and we, I just want to go back to something that Deb mentioned, Judicare, which I think Deb not only is a board member now, but for many years she was a Judicare panel member. And so we have staff attorneys that handle these cases, these poverty law related cases and domestic violence cases, housing cases. But my organization alone serves 22 counties. So it's about 23,000 square miles. So it is a huge service area, and we can't have lawyers in every single county and every single courthouse. So what we do is we partner with the private bar, and we call them our Judicare partners. As Deb alluded to, it comes from Medicare. Is where it originally came from, and we pay them a greatly reduced rate, but just a little bit of money to help them keep their lights on to handle those cases for us. So for example, my organization, I'm in Moorhead, but we also serve all the way up to the Canadian border, all the way down to Breckenridge, Wahpeton area on the Minnesota side, through Alexandria and up to Bemidji and all of those counties in between. And we have 3 staffed offices. But a lot of times we really rely on our private bar partners. You know, attorneys, rightly so, charge a high hourly rate to cover their costs and to make some money. And so when they work with us, they're really donating their time. And so we're thankful to Deb and all of our private bar partners who both do pro bono, which is free legal work, and then Judicare, which is like a reduced rate.
Yeah, I know when I lived in the Twin Cities for a while, it seemed like you would hear legal aid there because, of course, you'd have community groups and there would be a different set of environments. So I'd like to talk about what the difference is in rural versus urban or suburban settings because, as you said, Ann, this is a huge area.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think one of our challenges is, because of the huge area, is getting the word out. And that's one of the reasons we're really thankful to be here today to talk about what does legal aid mean, when should people call, how can they call, but in the rural areas, those challenges of distance and isolation are really pretty significant. I think when you hear poverty, you can kind of visualize urban poverty. I think an image, when people say poverty, a lot of times an image comes to mind. Actually in Minnesota, there's a higher poverty rate overall in rural areas compared to urban. It goes from about 9% in urban areas to 11% in rural. That number really varies greatly based county to county. So for example, Beltrami County has a very high poverty rate and a lot of needs there. But getting the word out and just letting people know that this is it may be a possibility for them to get some legal help if they qualify financially. I think if you think about family law cases, people always know you need a court order. We're getting divorced, or I need a custody order or child support. Or we do a lot of work with domestic violence victims and protecting domestic violence victims and making sure there are secure custody arrangements for people so there isn't that conflict between parents, and really protecting kids, huge part of our mission. So we end up doing close to 50% of our cases, our family law cases, because people know I need a court order, okay, judges, lawyers, they kind of go down that right path. But I also think it's important to think about other types of cases we do. We do a fair amount of housing cases, which again, if somebody's been served with eviction paperwork, they know they maybe need help with from a lawyer because they're going in front of a judge. By that time, it's often too late. So getting to people before these problems, these potential legal problems, become critical. We also deal with public benefits, people with disabilities, and making sure they get accommodations, whether that be a reasonable accommodation in a housing or an employment setting, so that they can be in safe, secure housing, sanitary housing, but also is employed and as self-sufficient as possible under their circumstances. So there's lots of other areas that we practice in that people don't always think about calling a lawyer to get help with. Educational issues, employment law issues, there's just a whole variety of anything but criminal issues really, or traffic tickets. I don't want to call for traffic tickets.
And building on that in terms of how do we try to get people before the problems arise. Legal Services of Northwest has been trying to be proactive in partnering with various other kinds of professionals, for example, dental or medical providers, so we can reach people maybe before something comes to a head. So we are looking at successful private partnerships, and we're also looking at broadening our financial base, so to speak. So we're not just relying on the taxpayers for all this. We're trying to make this a far more proactive, partnership, just a more broad-based kind of organization and operation, so to speak, from all kinds of levels.
So when people come to you for aid, is it often that you find that they're coming to you because someone else has suggested that they see you, or is it that they've worked with you before? What's the most common avenue for people who come to you or should come to you for aid?
We've studied that because it is an interesting question, is how do we help people find us? And not surprisingly, word of mouth is the most common. I think either been a prior client, or my sister, my friend, my neighbor was a prior client, came up number one. So we try and get out there and we put out posters and we educate, but not many people call because they saw a poster. It's that word of mouth, just like the same way how do you pick your dentist? Like maybe you ask, who do you like, or who do you use, or who might work for you? But the other way is other service providers. So other community organizations, whether it be nonprofits or governmental agencies that work with our client base, we try really hard to cross-train them so that they kind of identify a legal issue and know that legal aid exists and think, you know what, you should give legal aid a call. There might be a legal solution to this challenge. Again, maybe someone talks about something with their landlord, that's a common one. Housing conditions are substandard housing conditions. And back to the earlier point about some of the challenges in rural areas is if you have a problem with your housing and your kids go to school here, you have a job here, there might not be a lot of options to just up and move. Or if you get evicted, then that loss of housing can really lead to take you down a road with lots and lots of other problems down the line. So maybe it's a matter of holding that landlord accountable in that particular case to have good housing. Because the housing stock is just not there. It's few and far between. We have very low rates of vacancy in much of rural Minnesota, especially affordable housing for our clients. So.
Yeah. So how is this world changing? Because I know you've both been in this world of legal aid and helping people for some time, but of course, like all businesses, it changes. How is the work changing and how is the client load changing?
Well, it seems like we've closed more cases, as I understand it, in 2018, and more family law cases. So the need is growing. I don't think that the providers are growing, however, because like many things in rural Minnesota, young lawyers aren't coming back to replace the older ones.
Mm-hmm. That's a huge challenge for us, is getting those very rural counties. In 22 counties that we have, there's, without thinking too hard, there's about 5 or 6 counties where there's either one lawyer or one law firm that might have 2 or 3 lawyers. So there's just a lack of lawyers for us to work with to serve those clients. I think, and the need is continuing to be there.
Call it a legal?
Legal deserts is kind of the term they use, just like they talk about food deserts. It's legal deserts, and it's an issue across a number of Midwest states. And different states are doing different things to try and encourage private practice attorneys, whether it be loan repayment or subsidies, things like that. So there's things in the works, but it takes a while for those things to come to fruition.
And probably part of the broader job picture in the sense that white collar professions as a percentage of the workforce, as communities tend to change, in a lot of these rural areas we're seeing fewer white collar positions available, which of course affects the number of attorneys or the amount of work that's available to them.
And I think regardless of the community, having a local attorney there is just so critical. Like, of course, I want them there to help us with our legal aid cases and to work on my Judicare panel and do some pro bono work. But the community needs them too. I mean, in every community, there are legal needs that people have.
And even just from a kind of a public service, or even just somebody who can help give advice for maybe almost run-of-the-mill types of things, so to speak, to help prevent problems before they arise. You know, hey, look over this lease, for just what kinds of things should I be aware of? Can I get out of this, or can I sublease, or or the landlord saying, hey, is there something I need that I should be putting in this? You can help a lot of people on both ends, just prevent problems.
Yeah, I was going to say that I think as far as the issues our clients are facing, the issues, if you are low income, the issues of stabilizing your housing, stabilizing your family situation, income, they're just very, in some ways, being low income, not always, but can tend to make you more vulnerable. And just need someone to advocate for yourselves. There's stories every week we have of sometimes you just need someone who can pick up the phone and say, I'm a lawyer, I'm calling on behalf of so-and-so. Can you help us out here? And that has a little more power sometimes. We had a young man not too long ago, 16-year-old, who unfortunately had lost both of his parents. He had lost one parent years earlier and lost the second parent. And so had to move and had changed school district and wanted to go to school. So we've got this 16-year-old kid who wants to go to school. And the school was saying, well, you don't have a guardian, we don't have paperwork, we don't know if we can let you in. And he had tried through a social worker, he had tried himself, and came into our office, and one of our staff attorneys first thought, this isn't right. Something's not right about this. I just, did a little bit of research, found that it's called the McKinney-Vento Homelessness Act, and it said, he was a homeless student. He needed to be let in school. All it took was one phone call from her to get that kid in school. We made another phone call to our United Way partner who we work with. The kid showed up at school the next day with a brand new backpack full of supplies in school. Just a tiny bit of stability in this kid's life that had obviously gone through some tragedies, and had no parents at age 16. And just the fact that sometimes you need a lawyer to get those things done. There's lots of great programs out there, but there is something about the legal system that sometimes has some power.
So in other words, the right call, the right person, the right time, where someone may be adrift or searching, or in the case of this young person, looking for some answers to what most people would say, well, this should be a solvable problem.
Right, and it was solvable, right? I talked to my staff attorney, I said, did you use lawyer words? She said, I did, and I cited the statute, and that seemed to pay attention, so I said it again, and she was joking, but there's some reality there that sometimes that authoritative, the school then said, oh, okay, we do have to do that. And I think they wanted to do the right thing, but just had to be told why they needed to.
Sure. What would be the authority, or what would be the guiding document,
Yep.
federal or state statute, that would provide the basis that they need?
And that's where I think lawyers can really play a positive role in helping solve problems. You know, humans are imperfect. We're going to have an imperfect world. How can we make it better while we're here?
Well, and I know there was I wish I could remember there's a saying inscribed in the state capitol that, you know, laws work well when they make it easier for people to do good things and harder for people to do bad things.
That sounds like a good plan.
Right. And I wish I could remember who that was, but it's inscribed on the wall of the Capitol. It's one of the many sayings that you see as you walk through
And
the Capitol.
I think it's the Supreme Court that says equal justice under law. And, you know, you see the scales of justice, and she's blindfolded, and there's lots of, you know, you should have the same rights, both access to the courts and rights, regardless of your income, regardless of your race, regardless of your gender. And so we are trying to kind of balance that playing field a little bit. It's pretty intimidating to, courtrooms are set up in a way they're grand and they're formal, and to go in by yourself is pretty scary. And so having a lawyer by your side and an advocate is really a critical thing if someone's facing their domestic violence abuser in a custody battle, for example. Those are really critical cases for us to do, among other things. Now, we can't go in with every single client in every single case. We just don't have the resources as a small nonprofit. But we do try and empower people, whether it be telling them how they can represent themselves. Here are the forms that you need. Here is how you could approach this problem. Here's what the law says. And sometimes we say you shouldn't go into court. So one thing we also see as a way is keeping frivolous cases out of court. You know, can't prevent everything, but giving people good, solid advice, because sometimes they got advice from someone, you know, their neighbor, their friend at the bar, it's amazing where people get their legal advice from.
And since you mentioned someone, I think I just remembered the quote. I was thinking, I think it was William Gladstone. So it took me a couple minutes, but there we go.
It came to you, you got it.
It came to me. So, but if we go down this road a bit, it strikes me also that in a short, it's about empowering the vulnerable in many cases, correct?
Absolutely. And the cases that we really prioritize are those critical basic needs, you know, the schooling and education for this kid, safety, security, economic security, family stability. So those aren't legal areas of law, so it would depend on, you know, the case, but we're not gonna, you know, there are great lawyers out there that do, you know, personal injury cases. We're not doing those kinds of cases.
No, not, absolutely
You know, anything
not.
where there's a fee to be generated, we're not doing those cases. We're not doing cases where there can be money to be won that would pay the attorney. Those aren't the kinds of cases that we're doing. We're really prioritizing people who wouldn't get lawyers because they're low income and if not for legal aid.
Or their cases might be difficult and require maybe more than a phone call.
Yeah, yes, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and that's also, I expect, a huge navigational challenge for the people who would come to you or would need services is to appreciate that with the complexity of the law, by necessity, there is a lot of specialization. As you said, there are litigators who do what they do, and then, of course, there's the criminal side, which we're not really delving into here, but there are so many areas of specialization, and helping people to understand that there are these specialists in various areas in particular could be a huge part of helping them understand what they need to do.
Right.
Yeah, and our staff attorneys tend to be generalists in the areas that we practice in, because we just have to do a little family law, a little housing law, a little consumer law, a little public benefits. But that's where those private bar partners are really critical, to bring them in for maybe it be a wills and estates type question. You know, we have lots of great partners. Legal Services of Northwest Minnesota has been around more than 40 years and has been really started as just private attorneys doing the work. So we turn to them with those areas of specialty. Some of the intricacies of real estate, for example, if there's an issue with real estate, sometimes we turn to them and use their expertise. And I think people, you're right though, I think people, I don't know, people find out you're a lawyer and they say, oh, I have this question for you. About anything that I know nothing about usually, so.
Yeah, and it's so highly specialized. Deb?
Oh, I was going to say, you know, part of the intricacies have to do with, do we even know what kind of, you know, can we even accept your case?
Right.
For example,
Right.
you know, because our own internal rules can be kind of intricate too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing we've started doing recently is knowing that if people find us and we know that they're low income because we do a very brief screening when they call, and so they qualify, they have any issue that's within the range of what we do, trying to talk to them right away because they're in crisis. And if they've jumped through all those hoops to figure out they have a civil issue, to figure out legal aid exists, I think there might be a legal solution. And to talk to us, we have on-call attorneys that so they at least get an initial, not an answer necessarily, because it may be too complex to give an answer, but at least create that connection between the client and our office to say, sounds like you have a legal issue, I'm gonna need to see your paperwork, or I think this is what it might be, but I can't advise you until I know more. And sometimes those phone calls can clear things up pretty quickly, and sometimes it's the beginning of a longer term representation or relationship, but not telling people, oh, we'll call you back in 2 days, and then you lose them and trying to get a hold of them, you spend a
Right.
lot of lost time trying to connect.
And some things may be of the moment.
Yes. Yes.
It should have been dealt with yesterday.
Right, right.
Yeah, because and I expect many people don't come to you as early as they should.
Sometimes that happens.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, people may or may not understand the importance of a deadline.
And I think it's hard to think, okay, I missed my rent payment. You don't really think, oh, I should call a lawyer to see if there's a solution to this. Now, the solution might be we need to pay your rent, or it may be this lease arrangement is not sustainable. Let's talk about how do we arrange a move-out agreement so that your landlord doesn't file an eviction, which you're going to lose if you haven't paid rent, and then you're going to have an eviction on your record that makes it harder to rent next
the
time.
future,
That's a lot of
sure.
steps to think ahead of. So thinking, oh, I didn't pay rent, especially if you're in crisis and you're not paying rent, you're in crisis.
Or if you somehow think, oh, I'm not going to pay rent because something doesn't work. Well,
Right.
it doesn't work that
Right,
way.
right.
You still owe the rent.
So the
Yeah.
basic legal advice, among other things, is ignoring a problem and hoping it'll go away is not a good legal strategy.
Correct. Correct.
Get in and get the help as soon,
Yeah.
and start talking to people as soon as you possibly can.
We're trying really hard, both just community education-wise, and we will come and talk to any community group that's interested in having a lawyer talk about it, whether it be sort of a family law 101, a landlord-tenant is a very popular topic, things about domestic violence, things about consumer law, all kinds of topics, so that they can think about dealing with that problem upstream before it becomes a crisis, or at least identifying it and recognizing that. So.
Yeah, sort of preventing the problem before it starts by having people either, understanding what a lease is or what their obligations may
Yep.
be, or understanding, how to get into something and how to get out of something.
Right,
Yeah.
and oftentimes, like Ann was saying, attorneys from the organization will go out and speak to community groups
Yep.
just for that purpose, just to help, get people up to speed on what they can do proactively to prevent a problem.
Yeah, and a lot of our multidisciplinary partnerships, we work with 2 different medical legal partnerships, as Deb mentioned. So we work with medical providers because medical providers can provide medical care, but when your picture of health, there's a pie chart out there. When you look at your whole picture of health, 20 to 40% of it is called social determinants of health. It's where you live, it's your family relationships. It's things that really have a legal aspect to it. There's part that's genetics, there's parts that are choices, and there's parts that are medical care. But the example I always use is that if you have a kid with asthma, the best asthma doctor in the world can't solve it if the child keeps going back to an unfit home, where there is mold in the walls, where there is dust, where there is dirt, where it's just not an appropriate environment for someone with asthma. That's where a lawyer can step in and sort of make some difference there. So again, those multidisciplinary, talking to medical providers and our social workers and everyone else to start identifying legal issues as well.
So as we go into the last 2 minutes of this, I'd just like to kind of summarize. So as you said, you're in northwestern Minnesota, but wherever people may live, there are legal aid organizations near them.
Yes.
In rural areas, often regional, multi-county kind of groups. So where do people go if they are working on a civil law issue? How do they start?
Sure. In Minnesota, what I would recommend is there is it's Law Help MN, so for Minnesota, so the word law, the word help, and then mn.org. And that is a statewide website that all the legal aids across the state of Minnesota kind of contribute to. And it has fact sheets and just basic information. It also has a triage portal where you go in with your legal problem, it asks you a couple of questions, and then it tells you the resources. Again, if you're in Northwest Minnesota, if you go to Legal Services of Northwest Minnesota, either Google us or lsnmlaw.org is our website. where we're sitting right now is Central Minnesota Legal Services and Mid-Minnesota Legal Services. I think if you know the word civil legal aid and you make sure you get to a nonprofit, we will find you those, And if you're in South Dakota, there is South Dakota Legal Services as well. I mean, the whole country gets some federal funding. It's pretty minimal, to be perfectly honest with you, but there is some legal aid serving every county in the United States.
So there's some web resources. And
Yep.
Deb, final words on this?
I'm very proud to have Ann be kind of the head director, whatever, executive officer of our organization. She does a great job. It's a worthy organization that's really trying to help people who really need help.
Okay. Well, great. That's all the time we have for now. I'd like to thank both of you for coming here. Deb Economou and Ann Hafkin, Northwest Legal Services. Thank you both for being on Compass.
Great. Thanks, Les.
That's all we have for this episode of Compass. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Have you missed an episode of Compass? Every episode is available to watch free online at video.pioneer.org or on the PBS Video app. And keep up to date with the latest Compass happenings on our Facebook page. Search Compass on Pioneer on Facebook and hit the like button.